Boldwood presents We Belong Together, written by Beth Moran and read by Marie Lawrence. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. As I hurtled down the country lane, horrendously lost and half blind with panic due to fleeing for my life, sanity, and quite possibly my soul, it was perhaps understandable that I didn't spot the sheep in time. A sudden crack of lightning through the rain-splattered windscreen revealed it to be about 5 meters closer than whatever the stopping distance was for apocalyptic tornado-like conditions. Screeching in horror, I automatically wrenched the steering wheel to the right while jamming on the brakes, skidding into the opposite lane and praying that no one else would be stupid enough to be out here at 5 a.m. A few terrifying moments later, as I tried to remember how to undo the seatbelt, I swapped that prayer into hoping that someone would not only be heading my way, but carrying a tow rope and whatever else it would take to haul this hunk of junk back out of the ditch I'd ended up in. I closed my eyes, dropping my head to rest against the steering wheel as I fought to steady my rasping breath, and tried to ignore the creaks of the wheel straddled between the grass verge on one side and the muddy bank on the other. "Come on, Eleanor, get a grip," I eventually croaked. "You can't stay here for the rest of the night." Or could I? Huddling in the tiny seat, a loose spring poking into my backside, I contemplated whether the best thing to do was sit it out until the storm cleared and the sun came up. A sudden thud against the passenger window startled me out of my stupor. I scrabbled about for the interior light switch, feeling a mix of dread and hope as I finally managed to pop open the seatbelt and shuffled across to peer through the blurry window. Bah! The sheep. Presumably the same one. I didn't get that good a look at it the first time. Knocked its nose against the window, giving me another jolt. Slumping back into the driver's seat, I resumed, the head against the steering wheel until a better solution miraculously presents itself position. It was January. 4 days earlier, I had celebrated the new year, ripe with promise and potential, in a Welsh castle, surrounded by the rich, famous, and genuinely fabulous, wearing an outfit that came with the compliments of a hot new British designer, swigging sophisticated cocktails and sampling food created with the express purpose of impressing me. As the revellers chanted down to midnight, I leaned over and kissed my gorgeous boyfriend, who whispered that this would be the best year ever. And I had agreed with him. Now, half buried in a ditch, the tatty remains of my life spilling across the back seat, thunder and lightning booming in my ears, fear and exhaustion rattling my bones, I changed my mind. Which made sense, seeing as nearly everything else he'd ever said to me had turned out to be a crock of lies. But enough wallowing. If the sheep wasn't going to help, I'd better come up with another plan. I grabbed my phone from my bag and clicked to contacts. Okay. Who to call? Not my parents. They were hundreds of miles away and would be blissfully asleep for another hour at least. Not Marcus, obviously, since he was a scumbag liar who I was never talking to again. My thumb hovered over Lucy. As someone who had worked for me, was it okay to wake her up this early in the morning and ask her to come to my rescue? Maybe. But considering that later today I'd be terminating her internship, it hardly seemed fair. Besides, she couldn't drive. What was she going to do? Order an Uber to pick me up from Shallow Ditch, Winding Road, back of beyond, somewhere in the Midlands? Were you supposed to call the police under these circumstances? I twisted round to see if I could tell whether the back half of the car was sticking into the road. Thanks to the sizable verge, I didn't think so, Could I call them anyway? Or was that a waste of police time, given that there was no emergency? I wasn't hurt, beyond several bumps and bruises, and a quick check of the car door confirmed that I was quite capable of exiting the vehicle without assistance. And once I had to provide my name, let alone other details like why I was here in the first place, driving through the heart of a severe weather warning, in what might possibly have once been a stolen vehicle in the middle of the night, I didn't want to go there. The perfect person to call was Charlie. While she was unlikely to be able to help, as a person who I was on my way to visit, she lived at least somewhere in the area and would surely know someone who could. Either way, she would turn the whole thing into a hilarious story by the end of the call and have a bath running and a hot chocolate waiting for me when I finally made it to her farmhouse. But I couldn't call Charlie, because the last phone number I'd had for her had stopped working over a year ago. Around the same time, she disappeared on social media for the 100th time since I'd met her. I opened the Maps app to find out the name of the road I was on, in case I could persuade a local taxi firm or an all-night breakdown service to come and help. Bolstered by discovering that I was on Ferrington Lane, given that the village nestled into the border of Charlie's family farm was Ferrington, I began searching, managing to type in taxi right before the screen went black. And yes, while racing about my flat chucking random stuff into bags 4 hours earlier, I'd forgotten my charger. This was not good news. I slipped a few inches lower in the seat, shrinking my hands up into my coat sleeves and tugging the hood over my head. A couple of tears may have trickled out. My face was too numb with cold to feel anything. At this point, I had two choices. Clamber out, wade through the rapidly swelling ditch water, and wander about in the storm until either I found help, someone found me, or I died of exposure. Or I could wait it out until morning and spend the time trying to figure out what my next move was. Or even better, getting some sleep. Resigned to option 2, I gingerly climbed into the back and buried myself under a pile of clothes. The slight tilt of the car meant that I had to wedge myself in a half-sitting position so I didn't topple forwards into the footwell. The rain continued to hammer the car from every angle, even as the flashes of lightning grew fainter and the storm gradually blew into the distance. Eyes fixed on the deep darkness, I watched for the first glimpse of sunrise. I was woken up some time later by a glare of light, accompanied by the sound of tapping on the window and a man's voice. "Hello?" Jerking upright, my stiff limbs sending jumpers flying, I hastily rubbed the sleep from my eyes. It took a few gormless seconds for me to remember where I was, what had happened, and who I was. Tugging my coat around mismatched pyjamas, I'd left in a hurry. I braced myself. The man opened the car door, the glow of the sunrise casting his face in shadow. "Are you okay? Can you move, or are you hurt?" "I'm okay." He leant in and offered a hand to help me clamber out, steadying me as I navigated the gap between the back of the car and the sodden grass. Ouch. In answer to his second question, yes, I hurt. Almost everywhere. My numb fingers found a bump on the side of my forehead, coming away smudged with blood, and I vaguely remembered my head smacking against the window as I bounced into the ditch. The man released one elbow, and I staggered, my knees buckling until he grabbed it again, peering anxiously into my face. "Are you all right to ride in my car? It's about 30 minutes to the hospital. If I call an ambulance, it could take hours to get here." "No," I shook my head, instantly regretting it as a bolt of pain ricocheted around my skull. But my voice was a hoarse whisper, and I needed him to understand. "I don't need to go to hospital. I'm just stiff and a bit sore." I straightened my body as far as possible to prove it, biting back a wince as I took a step away from his grip, managing to stop wobbling after a couple of seconds. I really think you ought to get checked out. I shook my head. No, thank you. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the stillness of the storm's aftermath. Murky fields stretched out beyond the verges on either side of the road, the horizon crowned with the scattered silhouettes of bare trees against a background of soft pink and gold, watery streaks of winter dawn. The man, who looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, glanced at the muddy jeep parked a few metres away, and then back to me. I can drop you at the surgery then. The nurse will be able to get you cleaned up. He gestured at my head, frowning. Honestly, it's a few bumps and scrapes. What I really need is a hot shower and a change of clothes. I did my best to put on a nice, normal smile. But my phone died last night, so I can't get hold of anyone. Would you have time to give me a lift to Damson Farm? I got totally lost last night, so I don't even know what direction it's in. He folded his arms, the frown deepening. It's near Ferrington, Salter's Lane? I know where it is. Well, that was a start, although he didn't appear very willing to take me there. Or, if you don't have time, could I quickly borrow your phone and call a taxi? My weary legs wobbled again, causing me to suck in a sharp breath as pain shot up my back. I limped back a few steps and leant against the side of the car, which promptly slipped several inches further into the ditch. Come on. The man had grabbed my arm just in time to stop me tumbling backwards into the empty space where the car had been. He started walking me over to his car, one arm around my waist, as I rested my weight against his thick raincoat, too spent to argue. Oh, I need my stuff. I only remembered this crucial information once I'd reached the jeep and he'd helped boost me into the passenger seat. Before I could say anything else, he jogged back and fetched my shoulder bag. Finding the keys still in the ignition, he locked the car. No, my things from the back and the boot. I'll fetch them later. He slid up into the seat next to me. I really need to change my clothes. Or, more accurately, change into clothes that didn't create the impression I'd absconded from a care home. It's fine. No, it really isn't fine. He started the jeep and began pulling away, leaving me beginning to wonder just who I'd willingly climbed into a vehicle with on a deserted road at no witnesses o'clock. For all I knew, he was part of the whole thing. You idiot, Eleanor. I swiveled my aching neck around to get a proper look at him. Tufts of dark hair poking out from under his woolly hat. More than a smidgen of stubble covering a tough-looking jaw, and mouth set in a firm line. Wary hazel eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't think his thick curling eyelashes were relevant to this assessment, but the faint scar slashing from his eyebrow down to his earlobe was undeniably interesting. His hands were definitely working hands. Rough hands. Murderous hands, ready to strangle a woman and leave her for dead in a dirty ditch, far enough away from her abandoned car not to arouse suspicion. As if echoing my increasingly lurid thoughts, a thin wail erupted behind me. The driver simply sighed. I inched my head further round to find a baby in a car seat. I didn't know a lot about babies, but from what I could make out of this one, face poking out from the giant orange ski suit thing she was engulfed in, she was too small to walk or talk. Her eyes closed as she took a deep breath and let out another wail, scrunching her tiny face up and waving stubby arms, hands hidden in the sleeves of the suit. Without taking his eyes off the road, the man flicked a button, the pulsing tones of hardcore dance music filling the car. Really? I couldn't help asking. Even I knew this was not standard lullaby fare. But within a matter of seconds, the baby had stopped crying, stuffed a suit cuff in her mouth, and now stared at me with giant hazel eyes, as solemn and unnerving as her dad's. And while the frenetic music pounded at my headache, I felt a prickle of excitement at the choice of tune. This was one of Charlie's favourites. A coincidence or a sign? I was about to find out. Before the first song had come to an end, we had turned off the road and bumped our way down an unpaved track to Damson Farm. I rested my head against the back of the seat and blew out a long sigh. The dashboard display told me it was 8:17 a.m. The odds were a three-way split, that Charlie would either still be in bed, still be up from the night before, or be up and dressed and on her way out the door to catch a helicopter. Either way, I really hoped she'd be in. I was in desperate need of a bathroom, a cup of tea, and somewhere I could rest my battered bones. To my surprise, my rescuer not only got out of the Jeep, but unclipped the baby from her seat and walked with me towards the main house. The farmhouse was not quite how Charlie had described it. She'd told me stories of a place bursting with life and colour, chickens pecking about, semi-wild cats slinking round every corner, and dogs greeting visitors with a wagging tail. This place felt deserted, like a ghost farm. Faded, chipped paintwork on the door and shuttered windows. A dead clematis hanging off a rotting trellis beside the front door. The weather didn't help, admittedly. Gloomy skies reflecting off the grey puddles pooling in the gravel yard. But there was nothing else. Not a pot plant or a hanging basket. Not a bird singing in the distance or a string of lights left over from Christmas. Just quite a few straggly weeds. This did not look like the kind of place my best friend would live. For the first time, I felt a stab of anxiety that maybe she wouldn't be here. But I shook that off, even as I limped across, concentrating so my trainers didn't slip on the wet slabs that formed a square in front of the door. Damson Farm had belonged to Charlie's family for generations. She belonged to the farm. If she'd moved on, she'd have told me. She always had before. But the tweak of hesitation was enough to allow the man to stride past me, open the door, and step right in. After a moment dithering, my bladder compelled me to follow him, moving through a hallway and finding myself in the kitchen that Charlie had told me about so many times. Again, the picture she'd created of hustle and bustle, baking and cooking, the arga always warm, the kettle always steaming, was a million miles away from this cluttered, soulless, decidedly grubby and sad-looking room. The man dropped his car keys onto a pile of mess on a dresser. There's a bathroom across the hall. He nodded towards the entrance hall, paved with the same dark red tiles as the kitchen. It was when I glanced back that I spotted the high chair, the empty baby bottles amongst the mound of dirty pots by the sink, the pram pushed up against one wall. This was his house. His and the baby's house. So, where was Charlie? My brain stuck there, unable to process the possibility of what a man and a baby in Charlie's house could mean. I ducked across into the bathroom and spent a hasty 5 minutes sorting myself out as best I could, which wasn't very much, given what I was working with. After an initial glance in the mirror, I had to steel myself before I could face a closer inspection. I'd lost my hat at some point during the night, and my deep brown mahogany on a good hair day was now a matted mess. Huge, greyish, purpley ring surrounded each listless, bloodshot blue eye. The bump on my head was smeared with dried blood, speckles of which also covered the rest of my face. And if you could find a foundation to match this skin tone, it would have been called Hint of Corpse. Lovely. I splashed water on my face, dabbing gently at the bloodstains with some toilet roll, and wondered why on earth this man had let me in his car, let alone his house. I didn't wonder for long. My frazzled brain had far more important things to worry about right then, and to be honest, if he had turned out to be one of the bad guys, as long as he let me sit down and maybe have a hot drink before bludgeoning me to death, I couldn't summon up the energy to care. I returned to the kitchen to find a steaming mug sitting on the table, opposite where he sat, with a matching mug, the baby next to him in the high chair, giving the impression of a very unorthodox interview panel. Hat and hood off, I could see they both had the same thick, tufty dark hair. I gingerly lowered myself into a seat, before taking a few sips of scalding, sugary tea, while I fought through the fog to come up with something to say. Thanks again. I dread to think what would have happened if you'd not arrived when you did. The man shrugged. You'd have slept a bit longer, until someone else came along. But they wouldn't have lived at Damson Farm. I paused, questioningly. I presume you do live here? He nodded. I'm kind of surprised you brought me here without asking any questions about who I am. You weren't in a fit state to answer any questions. I took another gulp of tea, my hand barely able to lift the mug up to my mouth. So, now that you've warmed up and are sitting down, why are you here? I'm a friend of Charlie's. Charlie Perry? His eyebrows raised slightly, before he quickly pulled his features back into neutral. She's not here. I felt a rush of relief that at least he knew who she was, that this was the right Damson Farm, that she hadn't made the whole thing up to cover up a boring childhood living in a 3-bed detached house in the suburbs. Well, I guess that's not so surprising. Do you know when she'll be back, or have any contact details so I can let her know I'm here? Given you're having to ask me that, you clearly aren't that good a friend. The last number she gave me hasn't been working. I assume she'd lost her phone again. Look, no offence, but Charlie made a lot of friends. If you're someone she met in a hostel somewhere, or worked in a bar with for a few weeks, then I'm sorry, but she's not here. I can give you the number for a garage, who'll tow your car to wherever you're headed next, and drop you there once you've finished your tea. He bent down to pick up the crinkly fabric doll the baby had gleefully thrown onto the floor, then stood up, making it clear that I had finished my drink, whether I'd actually finished it or not. It took nearly everything I'd got, but I heaved myself to my feet, too, gripping the chair with both hands. I know Charlie makes friends everywhere she goes, which is a stupid number of places. I know she drops everything and moves on after a random conversation or an out-of-date flyer catches her attention. I know that she disappears completely for months at a time and then turns up again as if she'd never been gone. I also know that this is the only place she's ever called home. I know this because she's invited me here tons of times during the 12 years we've been friends. The last time I heard from her, she said she'd be staying here for at least a year, probably a lot longer. And this time, I believe she meant it. He eyed me silently for a long moment, his hand reaching up to stroke the scar on the side of his face. Eleanor. Yes, I'm Eleanor. Okay. He let out a long, slow sigh. And for the first time I noticed how tired and drawn he looked. His hazel eyes were utterly forlorn.
I'm sorry to have to tell you this, like this, after you've clearly had a crap night. But Charlie died.
What? The words engulfed me in a torrent of devastation. Shock and anguish crashing up through my stomach and lungs, my heart, until it hit my brain. Breathless, distraught, I could only reply with a gaping mouth and shaking head before everything went blurry, and then black. Chapter 2. I woke to find myself lying on a sofa, an older woman peering at me, one hand on my wrist. A mass of curly, salt and pepper hair framed her head in a huge circle, and glasses dangled on a chain over her thick Aran sweater. "Ah, there you are," she offered a brief smile. "I hear you've had a bit of a night of it." I swiveled one eye to see the man loitering behind her, his expression tight. "Do you know where you are?" the woman asked. "Damson Farm?" I managed to mumble. A living nightmare? "Excellent! I'm Dr. Ziva Solomon. Can you tell me your name?" I closed my eyes, concentrating, so I got the right one. Eleanor Sharpley. Aha! Keep your eyes open, look at me. Watch my finger. Very good. What day is it today, Eleanor? She asked me a few more questions along those lines. Keep looking at me, while simultaneously prodding about my person before nodding briskly. Bumps and bruises, but nothing serious. I'd put the fainting down to exhaustion, shock, and excessively low blood sugar. What do you reckon? I reckoned I'd feel much better if I was allowed to close my eyes and lie here in peace for a few weeks. I'm prescribing more sweet tea, some decent painkillers, and a round of hot toast. She placed a cool, wet cloth on my head, and it felt like I'd died and gone to heaven. Died. Someone's died. Charlie. Oh, Charlie. My face crumpled, the pain in my forehead intensifying as the tears began to flow, my heart contracting with sorrow. Charlie had died, and I hadn't even known. I'd assumed, just thought, that no one had told me. My best friend, and she'd gone. I hadn't even been at her funeral, said goodbye. Pelted by one realization after another, I curled over and gripped the cushion beside me, wrapping myself around it as if that could protect me. I sobbed, probably wailed a few times, dribbled snot and tears and goodness knows what else on the cushion. But I couldn't care less that I was in a strange house with a strange man and his matching baby, pouring out unbridled emotion while crumpled on his sofa. The doctor was there for a while, patting my shoulder and telling me how sorry she was. And then she was gone, and it was just the man, pulling up a low table and placing tea and toast on it, jiggling the baby on his hip and offering me a piece of kitchen roll. A good while later, and by that point, I could have failed the doctor's "what day is it" test. My tears dribbled to a stop. I took a few slow breaths, wiped my face with the remains of the kitchen roll clutched in my hand, pushed my hair off my face, and creaked to a sitting position. I looked at the tea. The man stood up from where he'd been sitting in an office chair. "I'll make you a fresh one." I managed a weak smile as he nodded at the baby, curled up in one of those baby bouncers head tilted to one side, chewing absent-mindedly on her fist as she stared at me.
Can you keep an eye on this one?
Not waiting for me to reply, he grabbed the toast plate and disappeared. I took the time to appraise the room. Too small to be the main living room in a house this big. It looked like a sort of nursery-study hybrid, with a desk underneath the large sash window opposite me, covered in papers, mugs, and other mess. The wall to one side contained bookshelves stuffed with books, folders, and other random items. The wall across from that had a changing table pushed up against it, on top of which was a mountain of tiny clothes, a packet of nappies, several of which were spilling out, wipes, bottles, a dummy, and other baby-related paraphernalia. The floor was relatively empty, but a pile of clutter in the space between the desk and the changing table implied that this was because everything had been shoved out of the way to create a path to the sofa. The walls were bare, the paintwork shabby. The grimy window was framed by a wonky blind. Looking up, a bare bulb swung amongst trails of cobwebs. This room was worse than the kitchen, full of stuff, but empty of all warmth or beauty. The man returned, placing a mug in my hand and fresh toast on the table. "Thank you," he nodded. "I'm so sorry for ruining your day like this." Sorry and embarrassed.
And I'm sorry you had to hear such bad news straight after crashing your car.
If you could call that garage, I'll get out of your way as soon as possible. I took a tentative bite of thick, buttery toast, resisting the urge to groan in relief.
I already called. The car's not fine, but, shall we say, no worse than it was before rolling into the ditch. They'll drop it off later.
Thanks. You've been unnecessarily kind. He shrugged, burying his face in his own mug.
Charlie would have done the same.
Probably. He looked up, the faint tug of a smile on his lips.
And then cooked you a 3-course dinner before inviting you to move in.
She'd have burned the dinner, though. Left the kitchen a total wreck and ordered a pizza. He full-on smiled then.
That sounds about right.
I chewed slowly on another bite of toast, working up to my question. Can I ask what happened?
How she died?
He sighed, putting the mug down and deftly plucking the baby out of her chair and tucking her into his chest before continuing. For the first time I clicked that this could be Charlie's baby. But before I could ask, her dad spoke again.
This is Hope, Charlie's daughter. She was born in June.
A girl, dressed in a green top and blue trousers. It had been impossible to be sure. I mean, she was incredibly cute, with thick hair and huge eyes, a tiny nose, and round, rosy cheeks. But don't most babies look that pretty?
Charlie had struggled with being pregnant, and afterwards she got worse. We discovered later it was postpartum psychosis. She was last seen by the old Ferrington bridge. They found her a few days later. He shrugged, face blank, but his voice had cracked on the words. We'll never know what happened. But I've reached the conclusion it doesn't make any difference.
I'm so sorry. My voice hitched. But what else was there to say? I was sorry for him, desperately sorry for Charlie, who had wrestled with what she called the evil brain death demons for most of her life. And at the time she had most needed to live, they had won. Sorry for the rest of us who had to live on without her, but sorry most of all for this beautiful little girl who would grow up without her mother. Charlie had saved me from myself, and now I felt awash with regret that when she'd needed someone to talk her down, when she most needed someone to believe in her, I'd been oblivious, slurping champagne and stuffing myself with cuttlefish tortellini, swanning about in my free clothes and worrying about how many millions of people liked me, when I should have been worrying about one of the very tiny number of people who loved me. The pain of grief, so much harder to bear than my superficial scrapes, my aching head and stiff muscles, settled over me like a thick, black blanket, and there it stayed. I'd met Charlie at Birmingham University. Under different circumstances, I'm sure we'd never have spoken, for no other reason than she wouldn't have noticed me. But we were both studying English, both had flats in the same accommodation block, and by the time we'd walked back from our first tutorial together, she'd basically decided we were friends. She invited herself over to my room for a drink, stopping off at the student shop for me to buy a bottle of vodka and some Coke, when I admitted that all I had was tea bags. I then had to admit I only had one mug and no glasses. After rifling through my sparse wardrobe, inspecting the solitary photograph on my desk, she plonked herself down on the bed, poured a generous splash of vodka into the glasses she'd pilfered from the shared kitchen, and made her pronouncement. "Eleanor Sharpley, you are in dire need of my help." I didn't disagree. "But that's perfect, because I think I need you too. We're an ideal match." She held up her glass to chink mine before taking a long gulp. "Firstly, why don't you have any stuff? Your capsule wardrobe says, highly organised, oversensible person. But who comes to uni with one mug and no glasses? It's like you didn't even consider the possibility of having a friend over." I had to bring whatever I could carry on the train. And no, I genuinely never expected to have anyone over. "No parents to drive you?" She leant back against the wall, sweeping long, silvery platinum hair off her forehead. "They don't have a car. I don't think they know how to drive. And they work all weekend. It never crossed their mind to come with me. It hadn't really crossed mine either until I'd arrived the first day of Freshers' Week and seen the queue of cars, jolly parents humping crates and suitcases, boxes of food and duvets up the stairs. My mum had handed me a tenner and a tub of scones and got back to scrubbing the banisters. It wasn't that they didn't care. They just didn't get it. Me leaving home and becoming a student was a world they couldn't imagine, let alone understand. They were sort of proud of their only child, but they were also bemused I hadn't been content to stay on and help run the tufted duck bed and breakfast they owned on the edge of Lake Windermere. "So, tell me one fact that sums up all I need to know about your life so far." I took my first tentative sip of vodka and Coke, blinking as the burn melted into a warm buzz in my belly. Up until last week, I shared a bedroom with my grandma." "No!" "I had the top bunk." Charlie burst out laughing. "Perfect! That's brilliant! It explains everything. Did you pack up her side of the wardrobe by mistake?" She leant over and nudged my arm to soften the tease. "I mean, don't get me wrong, I love you already, but you look like you brought your old school uniform." That's because I did. It was the only jacket I owned, and I might need to look smart for an interview or something. I'd pick the school badge off, of course. "So, what's your fact?" A couple more sips gave me the courage to return the question. Charlie thought for a while, twirling a strand of hair around one finger. "I ended up spending my first night here in the Aston Villa football team executive area in some nightclub. Only I lost my bag with my phone and bank card in it. I've got about 3 days' worth of food, if I'm careful. If the farm still had a landline, I could call home and ask my parents to send me some money. But nobody bothers memorising mobile numbers, do they? Can't you go to the bank and sort something out? She shrugged. I can't remember which bank it is. I just use the app. OK, I think we can probably come up with something before you starve to death. Awesome! Charlie topped up our glasses for another toast. And that about summed up the next 3 years of our lives, and a good few years after that. Charlie was my first real friend, and it turned out that despite her befriending everyone, I was hers too. She careened through her first year, always breathless from rushing in late, if she managed to turn up at all. She joined half the clubs in the university and left them all again, sang in the musical one term, sprinted in the athletics club the next. Holidays and weekends were one adventure after another, whether that was a part-time job as a roadie for a rock band or a day trip to London that evolved into a week in Paris. She lived for the moment, making the most of all the ones she could, because all too frequently, with shocking speed and devastating impact, the evil brain demons would come crashing in. She'd disappear for days, sometimes weeks. On one occasion, 2 months at a time. Buried under her duvet, her colour extinguished by the darkness, her eyes empty, words lifeless. I would call her mum, who'd sometimes come and bundle her back to Damson Farm, the place where she'd always eventually find some peace again, and gradually her joy would return, like the apple blossom in her orchard after a long, hard winter. We swapped her clothes for my lecture notes, party invitations for study sessions. Towards the end of the first year, she cajoled me out on my first date, followed by my first kiss with a lovely boy who I think only went along with it because he was besotted with Charlie. She spent one Easter and a few weeks the following summer working at the Tufted Duck, charming my parents and Grandma along with all the guests, until she was caught in bed with a guest's 17-year-old son. Before Charlie, I had been a girl who shared bunk beds with her grandma. With Charlie, I was a woman who saw life as brimming with endless possibility. And without her, I would maybe one day try to be the person she believed me to be. Once I'd stopped crying, put some decent clothes on, and found myself somewhere to live, that is. Chapter 3. After our brief conversation, baby Hope started crying, so the man, whose name I should really have known by now, spent a while changing her nappy and giving her a bottle and walking up and down until she would settle, just long enough for him to put her back in the baby chair, where she'd start bawling again. "I think we'll try a walk," he said after the third attempt. "She normally spends Fridays with me mum, and I'm supposed to be in a video call at 3. She really needs to go to sleep." "What time is it now?" 2:30. "I could take her for a walk." He looked me up and down. "I'll see if Ziva's in the orchard. She won't mind." Before stuffing Hope back into her ski suit and wheeling her out in the giant pushchair from the kitchen, he brought me in an oversized rainbow jumper and silver leggings that I could tell with one glance belonged to Charlie, and offered me the use of the shower. "Help yourself to more tea, and whatever food you can find, apart from the bananas. They're Hope's." "Thank you, and I'm sorry again for wrecking your day." "Yeah, I'm sorry for upsetting you, too." And with that, I was all alone in the farmhouse of a man I'd only just met, and whose name I didn't know, about to shower and change into someone else's clothes. Are you taking the mickey here, Charlie? I whispered into the silence. Landing me in one of your adventures? I might have heard the echo of a giggle wafting in from the kitchen. But by then I was crying again, so it was impossible to tell for sure. My host found me much later, crashed out with my face stuck to the kitchen table. I woke with a start, followed by a yelp as my sore muscles protested at the movement. Has my car arrived? I asked, once I'd accepted some painkillers and a glass of water, wincing with the pain of moving my head enough to swallow without spilling.
Yes, but you really aren't fit to drive.
I'm not going far. I'll be fine. What else was I going to do?
Ziva said you needed to be kept an eye on for at least the rest of the day.
He took a small plastic bowl from the pile on the draining board, peering at it before giving it a wipe with a tea towel. There'll be people there to keep an eye on me.
Where?
What?
Where is this place? And who are the people there who can take care of you?
With all due respect, and I owed him plenty of that, all things considered, that's not really your business.
I think you'd best stay the night here, he sighed,
lifting a banana from a bowl on the table and starting to mash it up, Hope banging out her anticipation on the tray of the high chair. I can't stay here. I mustered as much indignation as I could, given my current shambolic state. I don't want to stay here.
I don't massively want you to stay here either, but you're Charlie's best friend. She invited you. I can't let you head off in that excuse for a car when we both know that you haven't a clue where you're going.
Have you considered that I might think driving a short distance in my recently garage-inspected car to a nearby travelodge on the way to my parents' house is far safer than spending the night in the middle of nowhere with a strange man whose name I don't even know?
Daniel Perry.
Daniel? I repeated, as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. You're Charlie's brother.
Well, yes. Who did you think I was?
Hope's father?
I am Hope's father.
He took a seat next to her, offering her one plastic spoon to wave about while he scooped banana onto the other one. What? My brain was too tired to process this.
I adopted her.
So, does she have a biological father?
Well, she's not a clone.
He bristled, clearly not comfortable with the conversation taking this direction.
Charlie never said who it was. I don't think she ever told him.
He didn't add if she even knew who it was. And you adopted Hope? He shrugged, using the spoon to wipe up a blob of food on the baby's cheek like a pro.
She'd been living here since she was born. I was hardly going to pack her off to social services.
What about your mum? Charlie's mum, Billy, who I'd met the few times she'd picked Charlie up from university, and with whom I'd exchanged anxious, me, and resigned, her, conversations a few times since.
She lives in Ferrington now. She sold off most of the land and then married and moved out a couple of years after Dad died. She couldn't fit a baby into a cottage.
He paused, ran a finger absent-mindedly down his scar.
She hasn't been back to the farm since Charlie's funeral.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wondered how Daniel had managed it, juggling work, grieving for his sister, dealing with the aftermath of such tragedy, as well as a baby. No wonder the house was a shambles. Charlie never mentioned that Billy remarried.
She didn't know until afterwards. Mum wanted a quiet wedding. No drama. Charlie wasn't in a good place around then.
I did some mental calculations. Charlie's dad had suffered a fatal heart attack not long after we started renting a flat together in London, 4 years ago. I was 26, so Billy married when we were 28. I'd moved to a new flat by then. Charlie had left 2 days before Christmas and I'd given up waiting for her to come back or pay any rent. I remembered a message on Valentine's Day. Wishing my one true love a beautiful V-Day. Hope you get to spend it with someone special. I replied several times, messaging and calling to ask where she was and to let me know if she was okay. One reply arrived a few days later. Yeah, I'm cool. Met a guy who got me a waitress job. Bit mad out here, but fun. That was the last time I heard from her, until the final messages, sent just over a year ago. Back at the farm. Why aren't you here? Please visit. Staying for good this time. Lots of news. I'll explain when you're here. I'd sent a brief message explaining that I had work engagements booked out for several months ahead, but I'd see what I could do. She sent one last reply. Elle, I need you. It's different this time. Promise. Please come whenever you can. Kiss, kiss, kiss. But I'd grown tired of Charlie's chaotic interruptions hurtling back into my life, letting me down and disappearing again. Also, if I'm honest, because I'd become so caught up in my own life, which had morphed into something I'd never had foreseen, I never got around to it, until now, when I needed her. I don't know quite how or when, but without ever meaning to, at some point, I had become a horrible, self-obsessed person. So you'll stay? Daniel asked, snapping me back to the present day. I considered this for a moment, forced myself to acknowledge my aching limbs, bruised chest, the fog still clogging up my thought processes. Then I tried to picture setting off in the car and hunting for somewhere to sleep before I conked out at the steering wheel. I imagined the look on my parents' faces when I showed up looking like this. Damson Farm was shabby and dishevelled and a little bit dirty, if I'm honest. But this was Charlie's home, and I wasn't ready to say goodbye to her yet. Something about this place had wrapped its arms around me and welcomed me in. Peace. I realised this later that evening. Having managed a bowl of cheap tinned soup and more toast before Daniel showed me to a bedroom where he'd left my bags neatly lined up against the metal bed frame. For the first time in forever, despite everything having turned on its head, despite the hideous threats, the turmoil and confusion about my career, I felt cocooned in peace. Maybe because for the first time in forever, I didn't care about any of those things anymore. No wonder Charlie had loved it here. It was only when I woke up the following lunchtime that I realised I'd never spoken to Lucy. Chapter 4. I have a secret identity of sorts. More like a pen name. An alter ego? Except that for the past year, this other me has adopted the physical face of my intern and friend, Lucy. It's a long story. After graduation, I managed to get a job working on our local newspaper, the Cumbria Chronicle, earning a generous 20p an hour over minimum wage, making tea, running errands, and completing all other tasks that nobody else either wanted or could be bothered to do. Other people who'd got themselves an English degree with a dream of becoming a journalist might have worked to make something of this opportunity, chased down stories, left anonymous articles on the editor's desk, hustled and strategized and begged if necessary for that one big break. In my head, I was going to do all those things, once I'd learnt a bit more, grown a little wiser. For now, I was pootling along, helping out at the Tufted Duck to top up my income in order to afford luxuries like socks and petrol, and enjoying living in the most beautiful countryside in the UK. And then Charlie came to visit, and everything changed overnight. We had eaten out at a recently opened pub on the edge of town. It was, to put it bluntly, outrageously terrible. The worst meal either of us had ever eaten, served by the most incompetent staff. And then they had the audacity to drop a card on the table asking for an honest review on the Windermere Community Facebook group in exchange for the chance to win a free meal. Oh boy, the wannabe journalist in me was roused. Fueled by a nasty bottle of wine and my best friend, the review was most certainly honest. Having lived in Birmingham, my friend and I have enjoyed our fair share of delicious curries. We've also had a couple that resemble catsick. The gourmet gannet provides the novel experience of a curry that not only looks like vomit, it smells like it too. At least we presumed the lukewarm plate of watery yet gloopy slop, a true scientific marvel, was the curry my friend had requested. The waiter had previously tried to force a steak on her, insisting that my vegetarian companion had ordered it. "You must have got confused," he kindly suggested, scarpering away, leaving the steak on the table. "No, good sir, you're the one confused if you think we're accepting a charred lump of burnt shoe instead of the food we asked for." Poor chap, the whole debacle shook him up so badly that when he brought the alleged curry, he fumbled his grip and tipped the accompanying plate of undercooked rice into my friend's lap, which, no, was not cleaned up or replaced. Not that she wanted it to be, given that the scattered grains carried a distinctive whiff of rancid fish. But onto my food. Arriving a mere 17 minutes after the curry, I was tempted to ask if we could have the steak back. How difficult is it to create an inedible burger? Well, the gourmet gannet certainly rose to the challenge. Again, this left me questioning everything I knew about the science of matter, being both rubbery, gristly, and mushy, all at the same time. At 15 quid, I wasn't expecting Michelin star food. I was, however, hoping for something no worse than Ritzy's Saturday night burger van. You won't be surprised to hear that the chips were burnt on the outside, raw in the middle, and devoid of seasoning, or that the burger bun was both stale and soggy. I can't review the accompanying garden salad because I didn't want to deprive the slug of his single lettuce leaf and shriveled slice of cucumber. He seemed to be enjoying them far more than I would have. When I asked for tomato ketchup in an attempt to render the burger at least slightly edible, I was told, "We're not that sort of establishment." That makes sense, considering flavour of any sort seemed to be not their sort of thing either. I won't bore you with the dirty cutlery or the sticky, dog-eared menus. Neither will I expound on the hairs stuck to the table, or the dead flies in the ladies' loo. I won't blather on about the diners next to us, whose beef and onion pie looked as though it had been dropped on the floor and scooped back up again, nor how when they complained, the waiter told them that it won't make no difference to the taste, because that's their review to give, not mine. But I will tell you that both my friend and I invented a game called Grubby Waiter Bingo, including points for things like nose-picking, crotch-scratching, and coughing on the food, and that both of us got a full house before the bill arrived. I tell you this because it's not a matter of opinion, as the manager helpfully explained was the reason we disliked the food, but of protecting the health and happiness of the good citizens of Windermere. Gourmet? I don't think so. A gannet running the kitchen? That might be an improvement. To my utter amazement and Charlie's utter delight, the review went bonkers. You could say viral by Lake District standards. The Cumbria Chronicle editor called me into his office, not to fire me, as I'd expected, but to offer me a part-time job writing reviews for the paper, providing I continued with the humour. Back when I tentatively applied to study English at university, with the faint, flimsy hope that maybe one day someone would pay me to write something, I would have been horrified at the thought of mocking and criticising people's livelihoods for a cheap laugh. But in the 3 years since graduating, I'd had 17 rejections for the novel I'd submitted to agents and publishers. All attempts at getting a different job with a less tenuous link to writing had failed. I was broke, bored out of my brains, and beyond tired of getting up at 5:30 to cook a dozen breakfasts before going to work. And, more to the point, I was still sleeping in a room so tiny that even with bunk beds, only one of us could move about in there at a time. Something needed to change. I tried to keep things kind and fair, but the worse the reviews were, the more people loved them. Once a week I found somewhere different, maybe a backwater pub or a flashy, up-itself brasserie. If the food was okay, I would say that, and then maybe throw in something amusing about a poor member of staff or the decor. Perhaps how the menu struggled to cater for allergies. I would rope in someone else from the newspaper or occasionally drag one of the tufted duck staff along on some made-up pretext. Every few months, Charlie rocked into town, and we'd blitz several places in one weekend. Often, I went alone, which led to me more than once being able to write about a slimy waiter's attempt to hit on me. In the 2 years I wrote for the Chronicle, I wrote overwhelmingly positive reviews. I worked hard to find fantastic places to feature as a counterweight to the few necessarily dreadful ones. The first great article was for a restaurant specifically set up to provide training and jobs to those with learning difficulties. The food there was outstanding. Following my review, they were able to open a second restaurant in Kendal. Another was a couple who had a buy one, share one scheme, providing a meal for a homeless person for every meal paid for, along with cookery and gardening classes for clients of local food banks. One bakery was just so delightful, I couldn't find a single bad thing to say about it. A cafe run by a Somalian couple who'd arrived as asylum seekers a decade earlier was similar. I also gave a fabulous review for the breakfast at the Tufted Duck. Over the months, their popularity grew. Restaurant owners knew that a positive review would see an immediate increase in custom, and the token, although I was somewhat disappointed by, mention became like a local in-joke, whereby readers knew if the worst I could come up with was a dodgy ceiling tile in the toilets or a rude fellow diner, then the place was excellent. The power was overwhelmingly terrifying and addictive at the same time. And then a national newspaper called. 3 weeks later, I was living with Charlie in Crystal Palace. I had a blog, Twitter account, an Instagram setup, and an actual company credit card. They also insisted on a name, rather than the phantom food lover, as I'd been in Windermere. Nora Sharp was born, and she hit the ground running. Within a year or so, Nora had branched out into events. I started getting invited to book launches and award ceremonies, slipping about undetected in my uninspiring outfits with my boring hair and makeup, pretending to be someone's assistant if anyone bothered to talk to me. My followers grew from hundreds to the thousands, and within a couple of years had reached the tens of thousands. Despite increasing pressure from my editor to focus on the negatives, as again, that received by far the most interest, I tried to maintain my balanced approach, keeping the "although I was somewhat disappointed" section short and as sweet as I could get away with. I even started a blog as Eleanor Sharpley, writing unfailingly glowing reviews to counteract every negative one the paper printed. Yet, despite my efforts, even going so far as to have Nora endorse it. No one was interested in reading it. Apart from my parents and Grandma, who thought this was my real job. In the meantime, Nora continued to thrive in direct correlation to how heavily my articles were edited to maximise the criticism and downplay the praise. My new editor asked me to launch the YouTube channel, right about the same time that Lucy contacted me, asking to be my intern. And that was when things really started getting crazy. Having charged my phone overnight using the one yellowing socket in the room and a charger borrowed from Daniel, I quickly scrolled through the Nora Sharp social media accounts. Lucy had added a fairly innocuous tweet and Instagram post about Nora looking forward to a restaurant opening later that week. I checked my emails, but nothing urgent had come in since I last checked on Thursday evening. I called Lucy. I wasn't about to let her go over the phone if I could help it, but I could at least schedule in a video chat for later on, once I'd changed into a decent top and fortified myself with some breakfast.